Okay, so the first half of chapter 6. First question asks you, who was Benito Juárez and what country is he associated with? So Benito Juárez was the first full-blooded indigenous president of Mexico. Some of you were confused by the fact that the reading mentions that he's from Oaxaca. Oaxaca is one of the 31 states in Mexico. Oaxaca is in the south. And so Oaxaca is not the name of a country in Latin America. It's the name of a state in Mexico. One of 31 Mexican states. Now, the reading did not talk about this, so this is something being added from lecture, is an introduction to the Battle of Puebla that was during Benito Juárez's presidency. And that is when, in 1862, the French invaded Mexico to take it over. The French arrived with 8,000 troops, and they met up with the Mexican army that was only half its size, 4,000 troops. They met at the city of Puebla, hence it's referred to as the Battle of Puebla, on Cinco de Mayo, the 5th of May, 1862. The Mexican army was being led by General Ignacio Zaragoza, and even though he had an army half the size of the French, he somehow managed to win that battle. The very next day, President Benito Juárez declared Cinco de Mayo a holiday. And that's why, till this day, it's celebrated. Now, Cinco de Mayo, just a reminder, is not Mexican Independence Day. It is a celebration of having won this battle. Now, what you may not be told when celebrating winning this battle is the fact that the rest of the story, because Mexico succeeded in winning that battle, and they succeeded in kicking out the French for the time being, but they came back a year later. A year later, they came back not with 8, but 30,000 troops. And Mexico lost the war. At that point, France put in charge of Mexico the Archduke Maximilian of Habsburg, became the leader of Mexico when Mexico had an emperor from 1864 to 1867. At that point in 1867, France lost interest in Mexico, leaving Maximilian vulnerable, and Benito Juárez was able to retake the country and get rid of Maximilian. Now, this is one of many examples where the United States did not enforce the Monroe Doctrine from 1823, although to be fair, the United States was in the middle of its own civil war. And another aspect to this, and part of the reason for why it's been celebrated in the United States since this time of the 1860s, why Cinco de Mayo has been celebrated, is that France was interested in helping the Confederacy win the US Civil War. So when Mexico defeated the French at the Battle of Puebla on Cinco de Mayo, they indirectly and inadvertently also helped the Union win the Civil War by delaying the French from being able to help the Confederacy. By the time they came back, it was too late for them to make a difference in the U.S. Civil War between the Union and the Confederacy. Another early question in this week's homework introduced you to the PRI, the Partido Revolucionario Institucional, the Institutional Revolutionary Party. And you're introduced to the fact that the PRI was created after the Mexican Revolution. And so the Mexican Revolution ends in 1920 officially. In the 1930s, the PRI gets created. Now it's confusing, and I didn't penalize people for the students for this. It's confusing because it had different names earlier on, but it was the same political party. And so, despite the different names, that political party was created in the 1930s and lasted until the year 2000. And so almost 70 years. Now I'll connect it to a couple other things. This is not addressed in the chapter. Connected to a couple other things, in particular the drug cartels and corruption and so forth. So the PRI was known for being corrupt, and it was known that the drug cartels, especially starting in the 1980s, would bribe and buy off politicians. In the year 2000, and the PRI also started as in the 1930s. It was a leftist political party, but since the 1950s until the present, it's been more center or right, center and right-leaning. In the year 2000, the PAN came in power, the El PAN, and the PAN is the National Action Party, but PAN also means bread in Spanish, and the PAN is a right-wing party. Vicente Fox became president, and he is remembered generally favorably. People were happy to get rid of the PRI at that point. People were generally happy with the job he did. He started coming back in the news during the first Trump presidency in 2016 because, he was long gone. He was no longer the president of Mexico, but he would get into like social media arguments with President Trump where he would say like, that we're not going to pay for your effing wall, and he would give him the middle finger and stuff like that. And so he was getting attention, publicity, public attention again at that time. All right, so people liked the PAN, and so in 2006 they voted again for the PAN to have the presidency of Mexico. And you might notice here the 6 years. And so in the United States, we have presidents for 4 years, for a 4-year term, and they can be reelected one time for another 4 years. In Mexico, the term is 6 years, and there's no reelection. That was one of the changes that they brought about after the Mexican Revolution to try to get rid of dictators, was to say no reelection. So in 2012, in 2006, they elected another PAN, Calderon. Felipe Calderon is the one who started the drug war, the one who started using the Mexican military against the drug cartels. And he succeeded in taking out the leaders of practically all the big drug cartels in Mexico, except for one. The Sinaloa cartel ended up being in a certain way, they're seen as being the ones who won the drug war because the Mexican military took out the leadership of all the other drug cartels. This has also led to the belief since then that these different political parties are supported by different drug cartels. So yeah, different political parties end up getting supported by different drug cartels. And that's yeah, there some people claim that. So the Sinaloa cartel is a drug cartel that comes out on top after the drug war. Now, people in Mexico, they were happy with Fox, but they were not happy with Calderon because when he started using the military to fight the drug war, it led to a lot of violence. There was the violence between, there was the, how do you put this? When one cartel leader would be taken out, the other drug cartels would try to take advantage of that to take over their territory. And then there was also infighting. When they take out the leader, the like lieutenants, the people that were part of that drug cartel fight amongst themselves over who's going to be the new leadership. And then on top of that, you have the military that's not trained to be police. They're trained to follow orders and shoot. And so it led to a lot of violence, tens of thousands of people being killed with that drug war. So, after initiating that drug war, the people of Mexico voted to go back to the PRI in 2012. With Enrique Peña Nieto. I remember going to Mexico in 2012, right before the election, and talking to people and asking who were they planning to vote for. And I remember, I mean, it could have just been a coincidence that the people I happened to ask were saying this, but they were saying that they were planning to vote for the PRI because when the PRI was in power, like they weren't under the impression that all of a sudden, or that at some point politicians are going to stop being corrupt. But at least under the PRI, there was peace, and average people who have nothing to do with drug cartels didn't have to fear for their lives. And so I don't know, for me that clicked because I was thinking, I'm living in the US and I'm thinking, okay, the PRI is corrupt. They were in power for almost 70 years. Good riddance. Why would we want to go back to that? And it's like, yeah, but I don't have to live there. And I'm not the one, who has to fear for his life and his family's life while this drug war is being fought. And so, they helped me understand that. So they voted to not do that anymore. They voted for Enrique Peña Nieto in 2012, and he focused on trying to take out the leader of the Sinaloa cartel, El Chapo Guzman, and it's with mixed results. He would catch him, and then he escaped, and then they couldn't catch him again. And then they caught him towards the end of his presidency. And then there was a change in power. The Mexican public voted for a new political party altogether, the Morena Party, the Movimiento de Regeneración Nacional, the Movement for National Regeneration. In 2018, they elected AMLO, this is for short, because he's got first name, middle name, and two last names. His two last names are López Obrador. Full name, Andrés Manuel López Obrador. People refer to him as AMLO for short. When AMLO came into the presidency, one of the first things he did was extradite extradite El Chapo to the United States, where he was tried and sentenced, and he's in a maximum security prison ever since. People were generally happy with AMLO and the new Morena party. This one, the PRD, is the old leftist party. So we have the center right wing. This left wing party has never won the presidency. In fact, AMLO, well, no, yeah, and this new one, Morena, is leftist, but it kind of skipped. It didn't make use of the PRD. Yeah, Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador, AMLO, is, um, in general, people were happy with his presidency. There were lots of people, especially the poor, who had more assistance. Senior citizens started getting kind of like some retirement money. There was money invested in youth and education. And yeah, people were generally happy. And so then they voted 2 years ago. They voted to reelect the Morena party, with who's the current president, Claudia Sheinbaum. And so Mexico got their first female president with Claudia Sheinbaum, elected in 2024. And so she'll be there for 6 years. She's the president there now. And all the old political parties ran against her. She ended up winning with all new political parties. This is the Labor Party, and this one is the Green Environmental Party. Yes. These different political parties, yes, created coalitions to elect them, which is we have a two-party system, so we're not familiar with this, but it's very common throughout the world for them to have several political parties, and the political parties have to work with each other in order to have a majority to get someone elected. Yeah. But the weird thing here is that, or impressive or unusual, is that all the major political parties, all the major old political parties, joined forces against her and still lost. And so they had a lot of advantages. And just this week, Claudia Sheinbaum. So in the how do I put this? In the previous years, AMLO had been focused on attacking the Sinaloa cartel, and then now, what the cartel that became the strongest one was CJ&G, Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación, the Jalisco New Generation cartel, and their leader was El Mencho. This week, a couple days ago, here's Jalisco, Mexico City. Here's Jalisco. Jalisco is the state where everything stereotypical about Mexico comes from almost. Mariachi music, tequila, those things come from there. And in recent years, they had the strongest drug cartel too. But just this week, under Claudia Sheinbaum, the Mexican military killed El Mencho. And so this has gotten a lot of news recently. And yeah. All right. Any questions regarding the political parties before I move on? All right. This chapter introduced you to what happened in Guatemala in 1954. And so I'll begin with more backstory and some stuff that happened afterwards. So there was a U.S. company called the United Fruit Company. It focused on growing bananas, and it was very powerful. It had more money than any of the countries that it did business in. And so it did business in countries in Central America and the Caribbean. It had 85 ships. It had 1,400 miles of railroad. A lot of that railroad was private railroads. So they would build railroads, say in Guatemala, but they wouldn't be shared with the country or the people of Guatemala. It was just for their exclusive use. So they wasn't improving the infrastructure of the company. It was for only their own good. All right. Then in 1945, Guatemala elected their first democratically elected president, Juan Jose Arevalo. After that, they had their second democratically elected president, Jacobo Arbenz Guzman. And Arbenz passed this law called Decree 900. Decree 900 said that they were going to take away the property over 600 acres that was not being used, and they were going to buy and they were going to pay them for it. So this means that big landowners, they weren't attacking necessarily just big landowners. They were attacking anyone who had more than 600 acres that they were not using. And if they weren't using them, then he was going to take it from them and pay them, the value that they had said that property was worth. And to us, this sounds like a very anti-capitalist, kind of communist idea to take a business's private property. But in the United States, we do this as well. We call it eminent domain, and it's the law that is used anytime the government needs private property for the use of a city, a county, a state, or the federal government. And they don't have a choice, and we just pay them market value for it. And so it's even in the US, we have things like this. Now, United Fruit Company did not like this, and they convinced the US CIA to sponsor a coup that they called Operation Success in 1954. Now, to make these connections more direct, one of the board members of United Fruit Company was the brother of the head of the US CIA at that time. So it wasn't very difficult. There were very clear, direct connections between the board of United Fruit Company and the US CIA. They were, essentially brothers, or at least one of the members was a brother. And so this is one of many examples that you'll learn about, because even Clawson does this. We have a long history in the United States of talking about Latin America as a place with corruption and as a place that has dictators. The part that we keep out when we say that is how often the US played a role in putting those dictators into power and supported those dictators over their own democratically elected leaders. And so this is just the first of those examples that we're going to learn about. Yes?
Does the United Fruit Company still exist?
I don't know. There may be a company that came out of that still exists.
Oh, it says it was rebranded to Chiquita.
Chiquita Banana.
Wow.
Yeah. Thank you for looking it up. And so this also was the beginning of the longest and bloodiest civil war in Central American history. It lasted 4 decades. 75,000 people dead and disappeared by the 1980s. And it also helps to explain a lot of the Central American immigration to the United States in the 1980s, when most Central Americans came to the United States. So these are other countries brought up in the chapter. Next one I'll talk about is Nicaragua. Before doing that, I'll explain filibuster. The definition for filibuster that's most relevant for this class is not the one you're likely to be more familiar with. It's not the one where like someone in Congress is trying to delay or prevent a vote on something by talking forever and ever to prevent that from happening. The definition of filibuster, most relevant for this class, is when a person from one country gets an armed group and goes to another country and takes over the country or a part of it. It could be a port, an island, a region, a city. They show up and they say, "We bring you freedom and independence, and we're going to be in charge." And there's many examples of US citizens doing this, especially at the expense of Spanish America and Latin America. This happened in Florida in 1810 and 1813 and 1814. This happened in Texas 5 times in the first 20 years of the 19th century. And then in 1836, they succeeded. This is why Texas became its own country in 1836 before it was annexed by the United States as part of the United States 10 years later. Is because Texas independence was a result of a successful filibustering expedition, similar to many others that had happened. Now, after the United States expanded from coast to coast, then there started to be filibustering expeditions beyond the United States. And that's where the example of Nicaragua comes in 1855. And this is where we begin talking about William Walker. Some of the old historians that wrote about William Walker refer to him as the last of the great filibusterers. And I already talked about what a filibuster is. Now, before going to Nicaragua, Walker tried to filibuster in Mexico. In 1853, he got an armed group that went into northern Mexico, into the state of Sonora. Sonora is the Mexican state just south of Arizona. William Walker took an armed group there and tried to take over that state. He was going to make it the Republic of Sonora, an independent country. He shows up, he says, "I bring you freedom and independence, and I'm going to be in charge." And the Mexican military shows up and says, "No, you're not." Kicks him out. Now, this was supposed to be illegal. And so in the United States, he was arrested, but tried by a jury of his peers. When Manifest Destiny was very popular in the middle of the 19th century, he was acquitted. And so he became an expansionist folk hero. And so being motivated by, he didn't end up creating the Republic of Sonora, but he got a lot of support in the United States because that kind of thing was popular. And also remember, this is right before the US Civil War. And after the Mexican-American War, the South had been told that Texas was admitted as a slave state, but none of the rest of the Southwest was going to be open to slavery. And so after the Mexican-American War in 1848, Southerners start looking at Cuba and at the other parts of the Caribbean or Latin America to expand slavery. since the US had already said we weren't going to expand slavery into the rest of what the US got as a result of the Mexican-American War. So, as you read in Clawson in 1855, there was a civil war going on in Nicaragua, and one side of that war, the liberals, welcomed the help of Walker to help him defeat the conservatives. He shows up with a well-armed group and succeeds in helping them win, but then he ends up making himself president. He legalized slavery. He makes English a co-equal language with Spanish. And there were 11,000 US citizens who moved to Nicaragua to benefit from this expansion of slavery into Latin America. And the US did recognize his government as the legitimate government of Nicaragua.
That explains some of the old movies where you got the Confederates building Mexico. Trail.
Yeah, and we'll talk more about Confederates later too, going to Latin America. Yeah. Now, that was not the end of it. It turns out that there was one of the richest men in the world, Cornelius Vanderbilt, was already in Nicaragua, and he was there, doing his own thing. What he was doing was creating a precursor to the Panama Canal. You see, there are 3 places where there have been efforts to build something like a Panama Canal. There's Panama down here. There's Nicaragua, which is what we're talking about right now. And then there's the Isthmus of Mexico here. Till this day, there's efforts in Nicaragua and in Mexico to compete with the Panama Canal. Now, this is before the building of the Panama Canal. So Cornelius Vanderbilt, he was improving the port on the Caribbean coast, building a railroad through Nicaragua that led to this lake of the Lake Nicaragua, and then another short bit of railroad on this side. And that was his effort of creating a precursor to the Panama Canal. So, one of the richest men in the world, and he was not in favor of slavery. And so he was not in favor of what William Walker was doing. So Cornelius Vanderbilt funded the combined armies of Costa Rica, El Salvador, and Honduras to kick out William Walker. And he did. He kicked them out in 1857. But this time he was not arrested when he arrived to the United States. He was welcomed by US President Buchanan. And he still didn't learn his lesson. He tried to go back 2 more times. The second time he ended up landing in Honduras. The Honduran military arrested him, tried him, and executed him. And that was the end of William Walker. Anything to repeat or explain before moving on? All right. What happens later on? This ends up connecting to some other questions that were brought up. So this week's homework brought up the stationing of U.S. military in Nicaragua in 1912 to 1933, which again is a very apologist way of describing that. And so I'll tell you a little bit more background. So Nicaragua had a president named Celaya at the end of the 19th and early 20th century. And the United States and US companies and wealthy people did not like him because he was seen as not very welcoming of US investment. So the US militarily occupied, although the pretext was that there were two US citizens that were killed, and so then we're there, you have chaos, and so we're gonna station our Marines there to keep the peace. Well, this was a, what is this, 21-year occupation with the US military. And here you see some of the newspapers at the time, where citizens are being bombed and attacked. And, they're asking, actually, this was my writing, like, do you think they saw it as peacekeeping? Here, this comic from the time was saying, I only hope this temporary emergency doesn't turn into a war, which is kind of early. Well, no, I mean, this was happening back then too, but it reminds me of, the second half of the 20th century and since, where like Korea is not considered a war, Vietnam is not considered a war. Today, Russia, what it's doing in Ukraine is not a war. I forget what they called it. Like, something like this, like a temporary emergency. And so yeah, we see these similarities back then. So Sandino fights to get rid of the United States and the politicians that the United States supports. So the United States supported this guy named, no, I'm sorry, that's not right. Sandino supported Sacasa, which the US didn't like. Sandino fought against the United States to get rid of them, and he succeeded. He got a lot of public support. Nicaraguans did not like being militarily occupied by the US military, and the United States did withdraw. But when the United States withdrew, they left military advisors there, and they helped create a Nicaraguan National Guard. And so the US trained and politicized the National Guard and then helped get Somoza elected. Somoza was the first of the dictators that came from that family. And it's referred to as the Somoza dynasty. Nicaragua was controlled by dictators that were all from the same family, that were trained and supported by the United States from the 1930s until the 1970s. So again, Nicaragua did not have these dictators in spite of the United States that represented freedom and democracy. Nicaragua had these dictators because the United States helped to put them in place and supported them staying in power for decades. In the 1970s, the Sandinistas organized themselves and started fighting to get rid of the Somozas, and they succeeded. Their full name is the Frente Sandinista de Liberación Nacional, the Sandinista Front of National Liberation, also referred to as the Sandinistas. And this time I didn't notice any issues in the homework where that the Sandinistas were not led by Sandino. Sandino was killed in the 1930s. He was not around in the 1970s to lead them. Isaac.
So that name was just created in honor of him?
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. And there'll be other examples of groups doing that. Yeah. So the Sandinistas got rid of Somoza, the guy that the United States supported. So then the United States supported the Contras, the counter-revolutionaries, the Contra-Revolucionarios in the 1980s. Now, in the 1980s, US Congress had said we weren't going to do this anymore. We were going to stop doing coups and supporting dictators and getting involved to that degree in places. And so then during the Reagan administration, they ended up having to do it. They still wanted to support the Contras, but they had to do it indirectly and illegally. And so the United States was selling guns to Iran, and those profits were being sent to the Contras to indirectly continue to support them, even though Congress had said we weren't going to do this anymore. This was discovered. The Sandinistas shot down an airplane, and through that they were able to prove it disclosed this whole Iran-Contra affair in the 1980s. Daniel Ortega was active with the Sandinistas, and he became president from 85 to 1990. And then he came back again in 2007 and has been president since then. We used to take students to Nicaragua. I went, what year did I think I went in 2015. 2015 or maybe even early 2016. But later that year, the next year, things really went south. A lot of the people that we had contacts with in Nicaragua ended up being attacked by Ortega. It's like how do I say this? It's like Ortega was almost the opposite of who he was in his first administration. He became much more dictatorial and conservative and kind of fascist like. And so we haven't been taking students since like almost 10 years now. And hence, he's critiqued like this. Now they say Daniel and Somoza are the same thing, are the same. The Panama Canal. And so we already touched on this, but I'll repeat briefly. Panama was a region of Colombia. Colombia gave France permission to try to build the canal, and they gave up. It was too expensive, too many people were dying, not enough progress. They couldn't see the end was not in sight. Then the president of Colombia told the United States that he would support the US having access to Panama, but Congress did not back him up, and they had the last say. Congress said no to the United States. They could not take over the French project to build the Panama Canal. And then, yes, Ella, sorry.
Congress or the US Congress?
No, sorry, I changed the subject. So I was talking about Nicaragua before, and then now I'm talking about the Panama Canal. And so I'm talking about Colombia, and I'm talking about the Colombian president and Colombian Congress. Yeah. So the Colombian president had told the US, that he would support the US. But then Congress is the one that actually had to make the decision, and they said no. Now, another factor is the Darien Gap. There's this part between Panama and Colombia that is very thick jungle and very uneven terrain that has been considered for centuries as being almost impossible to cross. So the United States found someone, this guy named Amador, and told him, how would you like to be president? We'll support you in making Panama independent from Colombia. And, in return, you will give us permission to build the Panama Canal and the rights to own the Panama Canal forever. And so Amador says yes. And Colombia could not, they couldn't get their military over land because of the Darien Gap. And the U.S. sent its Navy to both sides to prevent Colombian Navy and troops from getting to Panama. So the U.S. sending its Navy prevented Colombia from preventing Panamanian independence. Now, we're used to, because we only we pretty much only learn about our own independence. And so then we associate it with freedom and so forth. But when you learn about filibustering and how much we did that, you learn that independence doesn't necessarily mean freedom. It could also mean a way of taking someone's land and putting yourself in charge. Now, in this case, we didn't put ourselves in charge of Panama, just over the Panama Canal. Yes.
Is the Darien Gap a part of Colombia or Panama, or is it its
I think it's split. It's shared by both. I think the border might be somewhere in there.
Okay.
Yeah. And today there's been more and more, sort of the Darien Gap has been brought up in world news because a lot of Caribbean, like in particular Haitians and Venezuelans, that are trying to immigrate to the United States have been coming from South America and have had to cross the Darien Gap and then continue making their way to the US-Mexico border to try to get into the United States. And so it's still very dangerous, although, in the last decade, probably more people have crossed the Darien Gap than ever in history. Yeah. So the United States gave Panama their independence, put Amador in charge, was given the rights to run and own the Panama Canal and also land that surrounds the Panama Canal. I think they were given a mile in each direction of the Panama Canal. The U.S. built military bases there and had entire kind of U.S. societies in those stretches of the Panama Canal. So the U.S., ended up building it. But they built it with the labor of the people that are referred to as West Indians. West Indians are the people from the English-speaking Caribbean. And so Jamaica is the biggest example, but other islands, Barbados, Grenada, Martinique, and Trinidad, are all Caribbean islands from which workers were recruited and brought to Panama to work. Over 5,600 of them died building the Panama Canal. This is during the US period, but if you include the people who died during the French period, 25,000 people died trying to build or in the process of building the Panama Canal. Now, the US had gotten permission to own it forever, but Panamanians were not happy with that. They were doing a lot of protests and they were putting pressure on their government to do something about that. In 1977, US President Carter and the Panamanian Torrijos came to an agreement. In 1977, they agreed that at the end of the century, the last day of the 20th century was going to be when there was going to be a transition from US ownership to Panamanian ownership of the Panama Canal. And it did happen. On January 1st of the year 2000, the Panama Canal Authority took over. And the canal that exists today is also very different and much larger than the one the US created over 100 years ago. From 2007 to 2017, Panama expanded the canal. They doubled its capacity with new lanes and locks, and they invested $5.2 billion. And the US currently pays the same fees as other countries. And when I say the US, it usually means ships based out of the US or US companies. US ships pay the same fees. Now, there's been a lot of tension during the two Trump administrations because there's a fear that China has too much control or power in that area. And so President Trump has threatened to take it back, to militarily take it back, or or I don't know, other possibilities. So all right. Questions, comments on the Panama Canal? All right, moving on.